All right, everybody, welcome to Art Brunch. I hope you were able to get pen and paper handy. I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're continuing our series, Myth and Religion, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is part 3. Now, I'd like first to acknowledge that some of you in the know, those who have some experience with astronomy, might think this painting of Galileo a strange painting to include in this presentation. For those of you who feel that way, wait until the end. Now let's start with a little activity, so get your pen and paper ready. I'd like you to write down right now the most important principles or values you hold. Most important principles or values you hold. Examples might be the primacy of truth, compassion, wisdom, freedom, goodness, caring, etc. Go ahead and write those down. You don't have to think too deeply, just what comes off the top of your head, just instantly. Next, I'd like you to write down the most important beliefs you hold. Beliefs. Examples might be a faith tradition, a philosophy of life, political ideals, social ideals, etc. Go ahead and write those down. You don't need to write more than 2 or 3. That's it. And finally, I'd like you to write down the most important activities in your life. Examples could include meditation, prayer, yoga, some form of exercise, perhaps your vocation, your work. Mike, I know your head might be down, but okay, you admitted and go ahead. You saw it. Thanks. Again, don't put too much thought in this, just whatever comes to you, the top of your head. And now I want you to look at everything you've written down so far and quickly rate the top 3 in importance to you. Place a 1 next to the most important item to you, 2 and 3, etc. So just do that real quick. Just the top 3 of most importance in any of those categories. All right, I'm going to move along because we need to move a little quickly here. So I'm going to move to the next slide. Now, many of us are familiar with this quote from Dr. King. If you've got nothing worth dying for, you've got nothing worth living for. Now, that sounds nice. But do we really believe it? Now, take a moment to look at what you numbered 1 to 3. Look at right now, 1 to 3. If an executioner approached you with a large sword and said, "Renounce these or die," would you? Think about that a moment. An executioner approaches you with a big, heavy, large sword and says, "Renounce these or die." Would you renounce them? Today, we will look at some of the numerous depictions of martyrs of philosophy and science. Socrates, Hypatia of Alexandria, Giordano Bruno. Now, many of you are familiar with this painting. The School of Athens by Raphael is one of the most famous murals in the world. It is the Renaissance great homage to the great minds of history. I'd like to begin with a couple of martyrs depicted in this work. Let's begin with one of the most famous martyrs, Socrates. His execution is perhaps the greatest sin against philosophy. Now, most people are aware that Socrates was condemned by the Athenian court, but perhaps not aware of the exact reason why. The official charges were twofold. One, impiety. Impiety, in other words, denying belief in the gods of Athens. And number two, corrupting the youth. He corrupted the youth by challenging them to not merely accept the teachings of their elders, but to think for themselves. And this was viewed as subversive. Now, however, like many charges involving a denial of religious tenets, the real motive was probably political in nature, or at least that played a major role. You see, he had ticked off too many leading political figures by showing the weakness of their political ideas, and thus humiliating them publicly. Now, despite being thrown in prison and with the possible sentence of death looming over him, Socrates refused to renounce his beliefs and was sentenced to death. Now, it's not that he was against all the Greek myths, only the ones that expressed base values and immoral actions. I think any of us can think of a few of those. In this fantastic work by Jacques-Louis David, we see the philosopher just after he is released from his chains in order to face his sentence, death by drinking hemlock. But even in his final moments, Socrates is not overtaken by his own fate, but uses it to offer a discourse to his disciples on the immortality of the soul. His followers surround him, and all are in anguish while their teacher tries to comfort them with his teaching. Now, this image is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art website, showing the vanishing point in David's sketch for his painting. David. Got to make sure I pronounce that in the French way. Now, notice where it rests. It rests over Plato's head, revealing the source of information for David's painting. Plato's account of the death of Socrates in his work titled Phaedo. In this story, we learn that Socrates was no atheist, but actually he was convicted of corrupting the youth of Athens, partly by introducing strange gods. Well, the truth is Socrates, like many living today, believed in only one God, the creator and source of all good. In Phaedo, Socrates uses his death as a final lesson for his pupils, rather than fleeing when he was offered a way out of his predicament. What is most heart-wrenching in this story, for me at least, is that just before this scene you see, Socrates had offered a final farewell to his wife and son. And he says that the blissful joy he feels in hugging his son is intermingled with the excruciating pain of knowing it is the last time he will ever do so. Joy and suffering are eternal twins. I think all of us, thinking of our own family history, can relate to this. Now look to the left in this painting. Notice the woman on the stairway waving. This is Socrates' wife, Xanthippe, as she makes one last wistful glance backward at her husband. And notice how David uses color to highlight the emotion in this painting. The brightest colors in the composition are the red of the pupil, painfully offering the cup of hemlock, and Socrates accepting it while pointing to his destiny, a liberated soul in heaven. Now, David does another strange thing in this work. Notice the apparent age of Socrates compared to Plato's, who sits at the foot of the bed. Socrates was in his early 70s when he died. Plato was much, much younger at the time. Yet look at how they are depicted. Socrates looks like he is in the prime of his life physically. He is idealized. Plato looks elderly. Why do you think the artist did this? Well, perhaps the artist wants to set this scene in Plato's imagination, where an elderly Plato looks back in time to a painful memory. What other reasons might David have done this? Why do you think David depicted them this way? Now back to our theme for the day. All Socrates needed to do to avoid his fate was to acknowledge belief in the Athenian gods, which he could have done with his fingers crossed behind his back, perfectly understandable, considering he has a wife and child to care for. And he could have pledged not to teach the youth to disbelieve what their authorities taught them, though continue to teach in secret. But his commitment to what he believes is the truth, and his calling to teach it openly, well, that's more valuable to him than his own life. Can any of us relate? Would any of us do the same if in his situation? Back to Raphael's School of Athens. There are only two individuals in the work who look straight out at the viewer. Do you see them? Well, one is the artist himself, standing with Zoroaster, the Persian religious philosopher, and Ptolemy, the astronomer. And the other happens to be a woman, Hypatia of Alexandria. She is depicted wearing a Greek tribon, the traditional white robes worn by many philosophers. She also happened to be a mathematician and astronomer as well. Now, not only did the artist present her in youthful beauty, but he also forced the Pope and his cardinals and bishops, and now, today, every one of us, to look her in the eyes in order to reflect on her unjust and horrifying death at the hands of a fanatical mob. Now, there exists a story that a bishop, upon realizing that the woman depicted is Hypatia, told Raphael to immediately remove her from the painting. Because she was a woman? More likely because she was viewed as a secular humanist and harsh critic of the church's corruption by power during her day. Way back in the 5th century, she was a champion of the separation of church and state. No one at that time was a champion of the separation of church and state. Not even philosophers and scientists were. She was way ahead of her time. But we must also realize that Raphael's intended purpose of this great fresco was to show that the greater scientific minds of ancient society supported the basic foundational teachings of Catholicism. Hypatia's scholarly work, then, should not have been viewed as a challenge to the church, at least according to Raphael. During her time, Hypatia wasn't just known as a well-renowned philosopher that just so happened to be a woman. She was the most esteemed philosopher in all of Alexandria. She was an outspoken pagan who believed in the search for knowledge and truth from within. She once said to her students that no priest should be allowed to force their beliefs on you and rob you of your right to evolve your own way of life. That's exactly how Socrates supposedly corrupted the youth of Athens, teaching them to think for themselves. Very subversive. According to a website I found affiliated with the University of Alabama, she said of religion, all formal dogmatic religions, I want to emphasize that, are fallacious and must never be accepted by self-respecting persons as final. Reserve your right to think, for even to think wrongly is better than not to think at all. To teach superstitions as truth is a most terrible thing. Now, like Socrates, Hypatia was not an atheist. She was a Neoplatonist, believing in a supreme being she called the One, or the Good. She also had many Christian students, the most famous being Synesius of Cyrene, who wrote her biography, and he became bishop of Ptolemy, a major town in North Africa. This painting by Julius Kronberg depicts Hypatia as a blonde and blue-eyed woman wearing an expression of deep alarm. Her right arm is resting on a philosopher's bust, appropriately. Notice her view from the window. She sees a church procession with a cross being wielded. Like Socrates' death, Hypatia's death was politically motivated, but religion was used to rile up the mob. Here is the context. In 415, Archbishop Cyril was competing with the local political figure Orestes for power in Alexandria. Hypatia sided with Orestes because they were close friends, and again, because she believed in the separation of church and state. But from this point on, Cyril viewed Hypatia as his sworn enemy. Unfortunately, Hypatia's story then turns to tragedy. Cyril riled up a Christian mob against Hypatia. She was attacked. She was stripped naked, dragged into the temple Caesarion, which was the headquarters of Cyril. And while still alive, her skin was ripped off using oyster shells and roof tiles. Her limbs were dragged throughout the town, displayed for all to see. Now, her legacy today is one of an intellectual hero, standing against religious fanaticism. But it should be viewed as a courageous intellectual, standing against political authoritarianism. Because her death, though at the hands of religious fanatics, was incited for political reasons. See any parallels to what took place in the 20th century? See any parallels to perhaps what is taking place right now in Europe and America? For the next 8 centuries, her story faded from history. I am thankful then that Raphael recovered her legacy and now forces us to recognize it by looking into her gaze as she looks squarely at us, as if to beckon us. Never forget me. Well, next I'd like to look at the philosopher and scientist Giordano Bruno, whose theories on space and infinity were far outside the standard understandings of reality at the time. So far out that he was thought to be either a complete lunatic or possessed of the devil. Like many thought to be crazy or possessed, Giordano Bruno was, to put it simply, a genius. He was a monk, a philosopher, a cosmologist, and a mathematician. He also studied esoteric strands of religion. Quite the showman, he gained fame among Europe's nobility for his incredible memory. Ah, they said, he must possess secret magical powers. The church, of course, believed the source of those magical powers were from hell. His ideas were seen as so dangerous that at his execution, he was gagged. The church didn't want to risk him spreading his heretical views to the crowd, even in death. Now, he sticks out in history for me personally because he was burned at the stake on February 17th, 1600. I was born on February 17th, though nearly 4 centuries later, so I can't claim I'm his reincarnation. This famous statue of Giordano Bruno stands in Campo de' Fiori in Rome, at the very place he was executed for heresy. An inscription on the base says, "To Bruno, the century predicted by him," i.e. the 19th century, "here where the fire burned." Its creation and public presentation in 1889 were only possible due to a rising tide of liberalism in the late 19th century, which challenged clerical and papal power. The raising of this sculpture represented the raising of Giordano Bruno from the ashes to become a cultural hero in Italy. Now, no surprise, Pope Leo XIII was not very happy at the public inauguration of this statue. In fact, he fought its creation. Giordano Bruno's trouble with the church began early in his teaching career, and he was known as an obnoxious agitator. He was very insulting toward the Catholic breviary, which is a book of rites. He said, "The person who compiled the breviary is an ugly dog, bleep, cuckold, shameless, and the breviary is like an out-of-tune lute. And in it, there are many things that are profane and irrelevant, and therefore it is not worth reading by serious men, but ought to be burned." Giordano Bruno's disdain for many Catholic teachings and rites ended up getting him burned. Bruno also took an interest in mystical faiths and esoteric spirituality, like Hermeticism. This modern work by surrealist Leonora Carrington has many arcane symbols and imagery, reflecting Bruno's interests in the like. But what really got him in trouble was the publication of a series of 6 texts which explored his controversial ideas on the nature of the universe. At the time, Renaissance society believed in a closed, finite universe. With titles such as On the Infinite Universe and Worlds, Giordano Bruno directly confronted such beliefs. Within such books, Bruno argues that the sun, not the earth, is the center of our solar system, that the earth rotates on its axis, and that the universe itself is infinite, full of an almost infinite number of suns. Well, these just happen to be the current teachings of science today. Bruno's books landed him in front of the Inquisition, and he was tried and found guilty of heresy. Unfortunately for Bruno, 16th century cosmology was deeply intertwined with Christian teachings, and to argue against this cosmology was to argue against Christianity itself. At least that's how the church viewed it. Here are the serious theological dilemmas posed by Bruno's works. If the universe extended out into space and time forever, then where was heaven among the endless planets and stars? And if the universe was full of infinite solar systems, as Bruno claimed, then what was so special about our planet? What was so special about us by implication? And why does the Bible not mention other planets and other galaxies? Bruno's ideas directly challenge the church's understanding that we humans were uniquely special and at the center of God's creation. Now, Giordano Bruno's work did not lead him into atheism either. Here are a couple of quotes from Bruno supporting this. God is infinite, so his universe must be too. Thus is the excellence of God magnified and the greatness of his kingdom made manifest. He is glorified not in one, but in countless suns, not in a single earth, a single world, but in 1,000,000. I say in an infinity of worlds. And how about this one, which resonates with many today? Wise people know that God is in things and that divinity is latent in nature. But despite these quotes, it wasn't enough to spare him. The Archbishop of Canterbury of the time, George Abbot, mocked Bruno for supporting, quote, the opinion of Copernicus that the earth did go round and the heavens did stand still, whereas in truth it was his own head which rather did run round and his brains did not stand still. Well, his brains obviously were not still. They were full of great ideas, great thoughts. Today, Giordano Bruno is an icon of the free-thinking and misunderstood genius who is sacrificed at the hands of the powerful and the ignorant. I imagine the naked woman in this painting hugging the martyr is a symbol of the modern freethinker, begging Bruno for the strength to not submit to the forces of foolish ignorance. Now, I find it ironic that he was executed in Campo di Fiori, which translates to the field of flowers. And I find it fitting that a statue honoring him now stands in the field of flowers. Today, his statue overlooks a food market. His ideas of the universe having infinite suns were verified centuries later. Ideas that bloomed too early for the church, bloomed too early even for the science of his day. But his legacy now offers sustenance to free thinkers. This sculpture of Bruno by Alexander Boltzmann stands in the Potsdamer Platz in Berlin, Germany. Notice that it shows Bruno upside down, a reference to the fact that he was burned alive that way. Not only was he tied upside down, but recall that his ideas were considered so dangerous, and he was so eager to share them during his life, that he was gagged as well before the pyre was ignited. Would it have been better for him and for us if he had learned to keep his mouth shut and just quietly continue his research and clandestinely publish his works in Protestant countries only? Did Giordano Bruno's big mouth make him a hero or a fool? I'll wrap things up with a brief word about this man. Most of us believe, well, maybe not most of you, but I think most of the people in the Western world believe that Galileo Galilei was also a martyr for science. Well, it's true, he was convicted of heresy before the Inquisition in 1633, but he was never sentenced to death, only sentenced to imprisonment. Due to his good relationship with many clergy, including the Pope, his sentence was immediately commuted to house arrest, and he was never imprisoned. Unlike Giordano Bruno, Galileo had a pleasing personality. Galileo is known as the first person to record his observation of the sky using a telescope. Many times, Galileo asked clergy to see for themselves evidence for his theories by looking through his telescope. He was most often turned down, the clergy citing that they had no need. Their authoritative traditions were enough for them. This is what you call willful ignorance. Unfortunately, it is still ubiquitous today. History has taught us nothing. In late 1632, just after the publication of his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, comparing the Copernican system with the traditional Ptolemaic system, Galileo was ordered to appear in Rome to be examined by the Inquisition. At that time, official church doctrine still declared the earth the center of the universe. On June 22nd, 1633, Galileo was taken to the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva and ordered to kneel while his condemnation was read. He was declared guilty of, quote, vehement suspicion of heresy, unquote, and made to recite and sign a formal recantation, which he did, sparing his life. Now, there is a legend that after signing this recantation, he mumbled under his breath, and yet the earth still moves. I don't know if that's true or not. So why have I included him then? Well, because he still suffered arrest and trial for his research, and so was a martyr in one sense. But also because I think Galileo is more relatable to us. He still is an example of a brave individual who ultimately took the action that many of us would have taken if we were in his place. And I'm sure he thought to himself after the verdict, just as he was signing the recantation, listen, here is how I see the universe, but it isn't worth burning for. After all, my books will survive me and prove me correct regardless of whether I die now or of old age. So I'll sign their little confession, but I won't mean it. Well, his decision turned out fortuitous for the science community because in the last years of his life, he published more important science texts, though they had to be published in a Protestant-controlled country. So let me ask you, do these figures still inspire you by their sacrifice? Or does their martyrdom make them difficult to relate to? For us personally, is there a principle, an idea, a value, a labor worth becoming a martyr for? Do you or do you not agree with Martin Luther King Jr. that if we've got nothing worth dying for, we've got nothing worth living for? What do you believe?